the intelligence agencies have been deeply involved in the lead up to these events. What actually happened in the last few days is still a bit of a mystery, but it's clear that Trump and Putin at the end of the week had a pretty direct talk, and I think Trump heard an earful because these attacks last week by the Ukrainians were deeply destabilizing. They took place just at the moment of these negotiations. They were an attack on part of the Russian strategic triad, the nuclear triad, very dangerous, very destabilizing. There was also the attack on civilian passenger rail that downed a bridge and killed dozens of people. And there's no doubt that the Western agencies were deeply implicated in projects that took place over the course of more than a year in preparation. So what we have had just today is a massive drone and missile attack by Russia all over Ukraine. The war is escalating. It's extraordinarily dangerous. The recklessness, in my view, of the Ukrainians and the Europeans to say no realistic peace proposals, no attempt to find a solution, just means more escalation, more devastation of Ukraine, more loss of life, and to no end, to no good.
Sachs doesn't hold back, pointing fingers at Western intelligence for their role in the drone attacks. He paints a grim picture of escalating tensions, especially since the attacks hit sensitive Russian targets like their nuclear assets. His frustration with the lack of peace talks comes through loud and clear, suggesting a cycle of violence with no end in sight. It's a heavy take, framing the situation as dangerously out of control.
Assets of a nuclear superpower is a mere pinprick. I think that this whole war in Ukraine, the whole origins of the war, involve the nuclear threat. Because the context of this whole war going back a quarter century is America's abandonment of the nuclear arms control framework. Probably one of the most decisive, but in a way under-discussed parts of the path to war was the U.S. unilateral abandonment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. And the reason why that's so important is that the United States destabilized the nuclear arms control framework, and Russia felt from that moment onward that there was the risk of decapitation strikes, the risk of a first strike nuclear attack against Russia, because the purpose of the anti-ballistic missile treaty was to prevent such an occurrence. Then the United States unilaterally installed anti-ballistic missile units, first in Poland, then in Romania. And I emphasize all of this because part of Russia's very deep, very legitimate, and very understandable concern about NATO enlargement was taking place in the context of the destabilization of the nuclear arms control framework. And the United States government refused to rule out also the placement of U.S. missile systems in Ukraine. And so the backdrop of all of this is that NATO enlargement was seen as a dire national security threat to Russia. We would feel exactly the same way with the installation of Russian or Chinese military bases near America's borders. This is a basic point that I cannot emphasize enough. What Russia feels and we dismiss or ignore is exactly what Americans would feel, what President Trump would feel, for example, if there was any attempt whatsoever of Russia or China to place military installations near America's borders in the Western Hemisphere. There's no doubt about this. So all of this is to say that when there's an attack on strategic bombers, it's more than a pinprick from the point of view of the Russians. Okay. It is, and it was an attack thousands of miles in the interior.
Right.
And then what Russian leadership can see is the chortling of the Western press and the Western political leaders. Oh, look how clever this was. This isn't clever. This is absolutely reckless, is what it is.
Sachs pushes back hard on the idea that these attacks were minor, arguing they're a big deal because they hit Russia's nuclear capabilities. He zooms out to connect this to a decades-long erosion of nuclear arms agreements, which adds depth to his point about why Russia feels threatened. The comparison to how the U.S. would react to foreign bases nearby is relatable, making the geopolitical stakes feel personal and urgent.
First, it's very unlikely, maybe nearly impossible, that the CIA and MI6 were not engaged in all of this. Even if they were not engaged in it, it's almost certain that they knew about it. If they didn't know about it, it's unbelievably damaging to the whole concept of the U.S. and U.K. support for Ukraine's war effort, that this could happen without the intelligence agencies knowing about it. Whether the President of the United States knew about it is yet another question, because the Russians have long said that the presidents are, sometimes just told after the fact, because it's the deep state that is at war with Russia. So that is a view that President Putin has expressed on many occasions. One in a famous interview he gave in Figaro in 2017, where he said he's dealt with many American presidents. They come into office with ideas, and then men in dark suits and briefcases come and explain to them how it really is. And yes, whether Trump knew beforehand or didn't know, none of it is exculpatory, because it doesn't answer any of the fundamental questions of
who's in charge of America.
Well, first of all, President Trump is. So is he listening? Is he taking detailed briefs? That's number one. Second is, of course, the director of national intelligence and the director of the CIA. What are they telling the President of the United States? Third, what actually happened here? How can it be that the United States claimed not to know? And what does that say about this entire war effort? If it were true, it's terrifying, because it says that Ukraine can use Western intelligence, Western explosives, Western technologies to destabilize the nuclear arms strategic triad of Russia. So there's no explanation that is sound in what happened last week, because what happened last week was a truly destabilizing event.
Sachs sounds skeptical about Trump's claim of not knowing about the attacks, and you can sense his concern about what that means for who's really calling the shots. He suggests Russia probably sees the U.S. as a unified threat, whether Trump was in the loop or not. It's a bit unsettling to hear him question the chain of command in the U.S., hinting at deeper issues in how these decisions are made.
I will say that Lindsey Graham has been the biggest failure of foreign policy in the United States Senate for decades. He's been wrong on every single issue. He has done a profound disservice to the American people and to our national security. So I find him ignorant. I find him utterly warmongering. I find him on the wrong side of just about every foreign policy issue of the last 25 years. So for me, the issue is not whether senators are involved. The issue is if they are wrong at every single instance. That is absolutely a direct threat to all of us. And what happened last week worsened your security, it worsened my security, it worsened the world's security. Zelensky is out of control. Zelensky is a cabal, a regime that is extraordinarily dangerous. It was installed by the United States in a coup in 2014. It is without constraint. It behaves in an extraordinarily provocative way. It has nothing to do with democracy. This is a small group ruling by martial law that is endangering the world. That's why it's the responsibility of the President of the United States to put an end to this kind of behavior. And as I've said, if the Ukrainian government doesn't want to agree, it is the responsibility of the President of the United States and the President of Russia to reach a security arrangement that is not destabilizing. Well, Richard Blumenthal is the one who said, this is the best that money can buy. All of this fighting and killing and no Americans dying. This is using Ukraine to weaken Russia. And that means sacrificing Ukraine for this neocon idiocy of these two people. They've both been a disgrace in American foreign policy. And there was Lindsey Graham back in 2014 in the U.S.-backed coup. He was involved in that. He was, of course, a big proponent of every war, the phony war, the real war, but on the phony pretext in Iraq, and all of the other adventures and escapades that have endangered American security, cost trillions of dollars, have been complete debacles. These two are just disgraceful in their substantive views. I don't mind senators having views. They should have views. These just happen to be people with completely wrong and despicable views that are endangering you and me and the rest of the United States.
Sachs comes out swinging against Senators Graham and Blumenthal, calling their track record a disaster for U.S. foreign policy. His take on Zelensky is equally sharp, painting him as a reckless leader pushing the world toward danger. It's a bold stance, and you can feel his urgency for the U.S. president to step in and cool things down before they spiral further.
But they're complete warmongers. They're so much driven by their intelligence agencies, probably linked back to the CIA as the one that orchestrates MI6, BND, other security agencies. But the rhetoric and the behavior of these politicians is absolutely reckless. Mertz comes in as Chancellor of Germany. You would think, not just think, you would hope, you would expect in a world that has some desire for self-preservation, that the Chancellor of Germany is newly arrived, would at least have a call with President Putin to discuss the situation, to make an evaluation, to try to understand. But no, from the first moment that Mertz came in, it has been expand the military, send Taurus missiles, strike deep inside Russia without even an iota of attempt at diplomacy. Starmer has been the same way. In other words, there's no attempt on the side of either of these two, who I think are basically factotums of their security states, and especially their intelligence agencies, to expand the war. So the absence of even a shred of evidence that they want to find a path to peace tells us what we need to know. They are warmongers from morning till night.
Sachs turns his focus to European leaders, calling out Mertz and Starmer for fanning the flames instead of seeking peace. He seems exasperated that they haven't even tried talking to Putin, instead leaning on military moves. The idea that they're just following their intelligence agency's lead adds a layer of intrigue, suggesting a broader web of influence behind the scenes.
I think that from the Russian perspective, they view this as the usual business, which is that they often don't hear a clear line from the United States. They probably don't know exactly who knows what and when, but from their point of view, it doesn't really matter. It comes down to the same thing, that they're facing in the United States a hostile force supporting a military effort that threatens their national security, and that's enough for them to know. So they obviously said to President Trump, no matter what he told them, that what happened is absolutely unacceptable, and it will be met with a Russian response. And that's all President Trump said, because whatever he told them, they told him something very, very clear, which was that this was an attack on core Russian national security, and it would be met with a Russian response. I think we saw the very beginnings of this Russian response today. But the fact of the matter is we're on a path of escalation right now. And whatever Trump knew or didn't know, what's been happening in recent weeks is no doubt a large and powerful lobby from within the U.S. security establishment. These two senators are a part of that, but it goes far beyond that. And within the security establishment of Europe to continue fighting Russia, because this has been a core doctrine for more than 30 years. This is not something new. And it is the difficult job of the President of the United States to put a brake on the military-industrial complex. That's the job. It requires skill. It requires steadfastness. This is a war machine that is always in operation. The president actually has to actively put the brakes on the war machine. It's not enough to not be a warmonger himself. And Trump has not been a warmonger when it comes to Ukraine. But it is an act of skill to put a stop to the war machine. We know presidents have sometimes paid the ultimate price for that, as John F. Kennedy did when he put the brakes on the war machine. The fact of the matter is there is a powerful big business, the $1.5 trillion business a year just in the U.S. alone, not to mention in Europe, and a powerful ideological force that says, just fight. That's Blumenthal. That's Graham. They always want to have war. These two are pathetic, but they represent a very dangerous foreign policy. And I just want to remind everybody, at the end of the Cold War, Russia, even the Soviet Union before the end of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, said, we want peace, we want cooperation. And here we are 35 years later at the brink of nuclear war. It's mind-boggling how the United States squandered the chance for peace. And it is in the likes of Lindsey Graham that we did so, because these people say if the other side wants peace, they're weak. Kill them. And that's what we've been doing for more than 30 years. And now, last week, there were supposed to be peace negotiations. And the day before the peace negotiations, Ukraine attacked the strategic bombers of Russia. The day before. What is this? What conceivable justification could there be? What conceivable good news could there be that the United States denies that it knew about it? The whole thing is so horrific. that it has to stop.
Sachs wraps up with a big picture take, explaining how Russia sees the US as a consistent threat, no matter who's in charge. He's clearly frustrated by the US's failure to seize peace opportunities over decades, pointing to a war-driven system that's tough to stop. His mention of the military-industrial complex feels like a call to action for leaders to take control and shift course.